So this paper is about low-frequency movement in the US labor market, about unemployment rate and the participation rate. So this is the unemployment rate, and the red is the low-frequency movement in the employment rate, so the secular trend in unemployment. And so the interesting thing is that we have this inverse U shape, so increasing in the 70s and then this marked decline, 80s and especially in the 90s. And well, I won't be talking about that part. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's going on here. What I'll be interested in is really this marked decline here, particularly here in the 90s. Now here's the participation rate. Again, there's an inverse U shape trend, but not at the same time. So we have this massive increase in participation. This is women joining the labor force. We know that. But what we are a lot more certain about is this apparently secular decline since the early 2000s in participation. And we are 5 years into the recovery or more, and participation has kept going down and down and down. And there's a lot of debate today in policy macroeconomic circles. Why are we so low? Is it structural? Is it cyclical? We don't know. So in this paper, what we're going to argue is that there's actually a common factor behind both trends. And this is secular movements and desire to work among non-participants. So if that sentence sounds weird, just bear with me for a minute. But what we're going to argue, is that the unemployment rate went down, especially strongly in the mid-90s, because of a strong decline in desire to work. And that the participation rate that we observe today that is very low is also because of this decline in desire to work. So first, let me be clear on definitions of what I mean by an unemployed, what I mean by a non-participant. These are the BLS definition. So an unemployed is someone who does not have a job and has been looking for the past month. A non-participant is someone who doesn't have a job and hasn't been looking. But there are other questions that the CPS is asking to the non-employed people. In particular, since 1967, the CPS has been asking consistently the same question, which is about wanting a job or not. So do you currently want a job, either full-time or part-time? And this paper is going to be about exploiting that question and digging into it. So to better understand what's going on with the non-participants. So the first thing we do is that we split the non-participants into two groups. The groups in red, they're always going to be red. I want a job, and the green, I don't want a job. And the first thing I'm going to show you is really the share of non-participants who want a job. So this is the time series we get back to 1968. And the first striking thing to us was, well, there's again a kind of an inverse U shape that's kind of reminiscent of what I just showed you for the unemployment rate. Another thing that's very striking is a strong decline in the second half of the 90s, this I just mentioned. And we're going to study this thing and what it means for the unemployment rate. There are also some cyclical fluctuations. This is interesting, but since it's not the focus of the paper, I'm not going to dwell on it. So of course, this question, want a job, an important thing is, well, what does it capture? Does it convey any useful information about behavior? That's crucial. So to see that, we explored the panel dimension of the CPS, where we could track workers across successive months and measure their transition rates. And so this is our view of the labor market here. So we have employed and unemployed, and the non-participants are made of two groups, the level N, which is not want a job, and the red, which is want a job for W. And the first thing we measure is the entry rate into unemployment. These are monthly transition rates, average. So you can see that a want a job is much more likely to join unemployment than a not want a job, by orders of magnitude larger. And a similar picture holds for the joining employment. Someone who wants a job is much more likely to join employment than a not want a job. Now, something I should say at this point, because some people might be, what the hell is going on? There's those people who don't want a job and they flow directly into finding a job. So I'm not going to, I'm going to stay very agnostic about these things. This is going to be an accounting exercise, trying to quantify what this change in the share of what a job means for unemployment participation. And I'm going to resist making any interpretation until the very end. And so it's a known fact in the literature. There's those people that don't want a job, we'll say, and they flow into employment anyway. So just going to take that as given. So this is the question we're trying to quantify. So there's been this large decline in the want a job share. What does it mean for unemployment and participation? The way we're going to quantify this is with in the tradition of the ins and outs literature, so going back to Darby, Altwang, and Plant, and more recently Scheimer, well, you describe the labor market with a Markov chain so that you have the number of employed, unemployed, and basically workers in each state that evolves according to this differential equation, which is change in the stock is driven by the flows, and lambda is this transition matrix. And from the stock flow accounting framework, we can build any stock of interest as a function of the flow. So for example, the employment rate, participation rate, and the share of the job. There's one more assumption we make, which is, again, pretty usual in this ins and out literature, that the unemployment rate is in steady state. So the flows are so large in the United States that the system converges to a steady state within a quarter. So when we're going to use quarterly data, we can assume that the unemployment rate depends only on this current flows and not on the past of the flow. So that's going to give us an expression that we're going to linearize, and from that expression, we can decompose movements in employment to different components, and in particular, the contribution of movements in the share of wanted job. So I'm going to spare you and we do the same thing for participation, so I'm going to spare you the technical details of how we do that exactly, just to give you the intuition. So you can see it's very simple. How does the share of wanted job affect unemployment? So it's going to affect through the average entry rates, okay? The unemployment rate is basically the ratio of these guys over those guys. So what matters, the change in the combination of this group is going to matter to what extent they influence the entry rate, whether people enter mostly through U or mostly through E. And remember, this is the transition rates I just showed you earlier. And the red guys were very likely to flow into U. In fact, much more than flowing into E. But if you look at the green guys, the ones who don't want a job, it's actually the opposite. They're more likely to flow into E than to flow into U. So what does it mean for the unemployment rate? Well, imagine you have a very high share of people who want a job, so that pool is dominated by red guys. And the flows out of that pool, the average flows, are going to look like red, meaning you're going to have large flows into the labor force, meaning a high participation rate, and you have higher flows into U than into E, therefore a high unemployment rate. Now, same story, but let's shift the weight towards people who don't want a job. Then the flows are going to look like the green ones, meaning low entry rate into the labor force, therefore low participation rate, and lower flows into U, and also into E, therefore higher employment rate. That means lower unemployment rate. And this is kind of the story we're going to be telling. This decline in the share of people who want a job is going to lower the unemployment rate and the participation rate. So that's the intuition. Now I'm going to show you quantitative results. Now for complete, I should say one thing, because some of you might wonder, okay, that's great and all, those want a job, they join the labor force. I understand they have a high entry rate, but once they're inside the labor force, maybe they do behave differently. Maybe they are very likely actually to leave the labor force next month and do it basically back and forth. So in this model, this is not going to happen because it's Markov chain. As soon as you join unemployed, you become like everyone else. But in the paper, we have also a more general framework where we allow those want a job and don't want a job to continue behaving differently once they are inside the labor force. And then for some time. And the interesting thing is that at the end, we get very similar results. It doesn't really change much the result. And the reason is because the biggest difference between want a job and not want a job is through the entry rate. Remember, here we have orders of magnitude differences between red and green. Once they're inside the labor force, the want a job and not want a job, they are different, but not that much. So at the end of the day, when you change the weight on the red and the green, what they do inside the labor force is not going to matter that much. That's why we get very similar results. And this is really the entry rate that matters. Okay. And now for completeness, one more thing we're going to do is that we know demographic groups have different hazard rates. For example, the young have very high turnover. So we're going to allow for heterogeneity across demographics. And as a side bonus, we'll get the contribution of demographics, which is a known important factor behind the unemployment rate movements. Okay, so here's the decomposition of unemployment rate. I'm going to show you in a second. So this is my estimate of the low frequency, the CBO estimate of the natural rate of unemployment. This is the contribution of demographics. So what did I plot here? Don't worry too much about the average level. What we care about is through this linear decomposition, is the movements in employment that are explained by demographics. So we split the population into 10 age groups and sex. And this inverse U shape here is the aging of the baby boom. This is a point that Scheimer made actually almost 20 years ago, also in the NBER macroannual, and that the unemployment went up and went down because of the share of young workers. Young workers have a high turnover, high unemployment rate, and now there's less of them, and therefore we have a low unemployment rate. That's about 0.7 percentage point, the total decline. Okay, so now what about the share of wanted job? So you can look, green, blue, the magnitude is about as large. So those wanted job, they seem to matter a lot to understand those low frequency movement. And notice the strong decline here in the mid-90s that you see again, that's about half a percentage point of unemployment. Okay, so from a Fed perspective, that's a large number. And what's interesting is that when you put the red and the green together, this is what you get. And I didn't cook that up. In fact, I didn't have the natural rate picture before. It was a suggestion of Jonathan to have some sort of flow frequency. And I was really struck by, when you put the two together, it seems like you explain the bulk of those low frequency movement in unemployment. In fact, this large decline here in the mid-90s, you can see a combination of demographics and share of wanted job. Okay, so now let me move to the participation rate. So there are many ways to present the results. So the participation rate, it's a bit easier to do a slightly different exercise. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the participation rate along with counterfactual participation rate where I'll hold the composition constant. What composition? First, let me hold the demographic composition constant, so age and sex. And I hold it at its 69 value. So here, the two lines should be the same. And then you can see that for most of the history of the participation rate, demographics hasn't had much effect on the participation rate, except basically since the end of the recession. So there's a huge effect here and a huge gap opening up, and it's driven by old workers, whereas the effect on demographic unemployment is driven by young workers. For participation, is driven by old workers. Why? Because old workers have a very low participation rate. And what happened there is that the 65 and over age group has really increased a lot lately, and that opened up this gap. Okay, so that's the contribution of demographics. How about the contribution of wanted job? So again, I'm going to hold the composition of wanted job constant at its 69 value. So here the two lines are the same. And the blue is what would have happened to participation if there hadn't been all these movements in the share of wanted job. And first, when you compare green and blue, you can see that, well, wanted job actually matters even more. And what happened? Well, so you had the 70s, and then remember in the 70s you had the desire to work that actually the share of wanted job that went up, and so this gap opened up. Meaning that participation was higher than it would have been under a constant share of wanted job. And then this gap was there, and you can see this big crossing. The big crossing is the decline in the share of wanted job in the mid-90s, the second half of the 90s. And what's interesting is that in the second half of the 90s, no one was talking about lower desire to work or things like this because participation rate was going up. This is the red line. The thing is that given the really strong labor market that we had, the strong job finding rate that we had, actually, if there hadn't been the desire to work, we should have had an explosion in participation to some extent. It should have gone up to that level. So the gap should have opened up. We just didn't see it because we didn't have this counterfactual. Okay. And now the gap opened up, meaning that now because we have this low desire to work, well, we have a lower participation rate. And this is, you can see here, there's this gap that opened up. And then when you put the two together, so wanted job and demographic, this is very striking as of what's happening these days, because you have a very large gap from those two composition effects. So it seems that aging and lower desire to work are a big part of the low participation rate today. Okay, now a natural question is, all right, so you just told me that the share of wanted job went down. Why? Where did those wanted job go? What happened to them? Well, the nice thing about this stock flow exercise is that we can do the same exercise for the share of wanted job. Okay, we can decompose the flows responsible for this stock, for the movements in this stock. Okay, and so there are all these possible flows that could matter. But what we find is that the decline in the share wanted job is driven only by two flows, those two. So I want a job, I don't want a job. So people switching this thing. So how do I show that? Well, this is the exercise we do. So in blue is the share wanted job since 94, the one we observe. And in green is the counterfactual where only two flows are allowed to move. This is the flows between I want a job and I don't want a job. Did you stop the clock? Okay. That's okay. And So this is, so we can see that the green line is pretty close to the blue line in the sense that this decline in the share wanted job is really driven by those two flows. And it's interesting because it means that those wanted job is not that they were absorbed by the labor market, let's say, during the strong, high-tech, the high-tech boom of the second half of the 90s. It's not like they joined the labor force. Instead, it seems like they moved away from the labor force. So the wanted job became less interested. They moved to not want a job. So, okay, here comes the big question is that, okay, why do we have this decline desire to work in the second half of the 90s? And for the first time, I'm going to stop being completely accounting, so agnostic of things. I need to take a stand about what I think about this wanted job question. So this is the simplest way we could think about it. So there are search frictions in the labor market, and we need to search to find a job. And the wanted job question just helps you measure search intensity. And all these non-employment states that the household survey measures, not want a job, unemployed, are just arbitrary distinction introduced by the household survey and its perfect measurement of search intensity. So we put people in blocks, but in fact, search intensity is on the real line. And so once you have this framework in mind, then search intensity, or this propensity to report I want a job, depends on the returns to employment, the returns to non-participation, is that going to be important for our story? So welfare, disability, or the added worker effect, for instance. So we know there were really large wage gains in the second half of the 90s because of the labor market boom. And through the added worker effect, meaning if you're a secondary earner and you see your spouse making more money, you're less likely to search for a job. Okay. So let me, before doing a quantitative exercise to see what explanation may work or may not work, let me look a bit into subgroups of what happened. So first, the decline is in wanted job is primarily a prime-age female phenomenon. So this is the number of not wanted job that disappeared. Okay, it's about 1 million for women, but about only a quarter of that for prime-age male. So primarily a female and to some extent young people. Second thing, this is a non-single household phenomenon. So if you live alone, no decline in desire to work. It's only if you live in a family. Okay, now if you live in a family, how about the income of the family? Well, it's only low income. This is first quintile, second quintile, big decline desire to work. If you look at the top quintile, much less so. So it's a low-income problem. How about low-income families with children, without children? When you have children, lower decline. Okay? So there's a bunch of facts. I recapped them here. But it seems like an explanation for this decline in desire to work has to be looked to an explanation that works to these groups, low-income families. So typically single mothers, for instance. And what major change happened in the 90s that could have affected these groups? Well, there's the welfare reform. So there was this big welfare reform in the 90s. Let me show you a bit with one picture what they did. This is the Clinton welfare to work. Well, there was two steps. One was Clinton, one was before that. The first one is the AFDC-10 reform. So AFDC is the traditional welfare. To be eligible, you have to be low income and you need to have children. The C is for children, the N is needy, no income. So what you saw is that the reform was in 96, big decline in welfare caseloads, and therefore big decline in spending. This is government spending for this thing. So really, really strong decline in welfare, while at the same time there was a massive expansion of the EITC, which is the earned income tax credit. So the idea of this welfare to work was to shift the people from welfare to push them into the labor force, and by giving them incentive to work, you put them tax credit. Another interesting thing that happened around that time is the SSI. This is supplemental security income. For this group I'm going to look at, this is disability income for low income people. So just remember that this thing actually went up. And so what we want to do now is to quantify, okay, what may have happened, what is the most plausible explanation. So what we're going to do to do that, well, we're going to estimate a very simple linear probability model. This is the probability you report wanting a job on some characteristics. What kind of characteristics? Well, if you have children, if you're married, anything we could think of, we threw in. And then income categories. So income categories are welfare benefits, disability insurance, the family income, this is to capture an added worker effect, the wealth income, taxes, and so on. And then importantly, we put a time dummy, so a year dummy, because we want to estimate this relationship in the cross-section, so using cross-sectional variation, and use those estimates to see how much of the decline in the share wanted job we can predict in the time series. Well, and then the interesting thing we find is that actually this regression, so I can show you the estimates, if you're interested after that. But we explained about 50 to 60% of the decline in the share of want a job through two things. The first thing is the decline is welfare caseloads. So when you're on welfare, you have to you have to show that you want to go back to work. You have to do job training. You have to take part in programs, go back to work pretty rapidly. And so people who are on welfare, they're actually more likely to find a job. And this decline in welfare caseloads has brought down the people who want a job. Disability had the opposite effect. Disability went up. When you're on disability, by definition, you cannot work. So you're very unlikely to do that. And this is the two main effects we find. We don't find much for the added worker effect. So, okay, let me discuss then this result, because it's a bit surprising at first glance. This welfare to work, if you're familiar with it, first it was meant to increase desire to work. It was meant to push people into the labor force. In general, it's believed to have succeeded. I mean, participation rate, for example, of single mothers increased a lot during that time. We think this is not necessarily consistent with what we find. Here's our conjecture. So what the welfare reform mainly did is two things. It made welfare stricter in terms of work requirements. And you had to find the jobs within 2 years. You had to do a lot of job training preparation. Basically, if you think about my conceptual framework, you had to have a minimum level of search intensity that went up. All right. And then it's kind of a sink or swim experiment. If you have a low disutility of search, or if you have a high marginal effect of higher search on job finding probability, that pushes you into the labor force. Okay? And this is perhaps what would have happened to some groups. However, if the weaker welfare participants, so if you had this utility of search, low labor market prospect, and so on, well, maybe this pushed you out of welfare. For example, there are time limits on the welfare system introduced by the reform that could have pushed you out. What could have pushed you? In disability. There's a literature actually documenting the substitutability between AFDC, so welfare, and SSI, which is just disability. And so this is one hypothesis. And the interesting thing is that then this has an interesting implication, that this reform, welfare to work reform, could have shifted the weaker non-participants from a program that had some connection to the labor force, welfare, to a program that had absolutely no connection to labor force, which is disability. Meaning that it had the opposite effect that is intended. And through that effect, it lowered unemployment rate because it kicked out those guys. Okay, so let me conclude. So we have a new factor behind both trends in employment and participation rate. In particular, a strong decline in the share of want a job in the second half of the 90s. And one question we're asking, our cross-sectional estimates suggest that. We also have diff and diff estimates that suggest that the welfare reform might be behind this decline. And just as the last word, how about the unemployment rate going forward? Well, remember, those two composition effects, aging and want a job, well, they're still very low. All right? So if you go back to 2000, we have an unemployment rate of 3.8%. We still have the exact same lower floor unemployment from this composition effect, which means that if you go back to the peak of 2000, you can imagine an unemployment rate of 3.8%. Even perhaps more realistically, back to 2006, we still get an unemployment rate of 4.4%. So we still have a lot of room to go. What's going on right now is the job finding rate is very low. But if you catch up with that, there's no reason we can get that. Thank you.